Welcome to At the Helm with Adventureman Dan. Let's start the adventure. Hello and welcome to the first ever Adventureman Dan podcast episode of At the Helm. I'm so very honored you're joining me here today. It is the 15th of September 2020, and I'm recording from my editing station aboard Adventureborn, currently docked in Fort Pierce, Florida. Alright, so today I'm going to be discussing who is Adventureman Dan and how did he get here. I figured I'd give you guys a sense of who I am and where my perspectives come from, laying the groundwork for future episodes. So first off, what is Adventureman Dan? Adventureman Dan is my persona. It's a persona of a pure, unrestricted, unadulterated, and uncompromising spirit to journey around the globe, collecting experiences and stories to share with the world. Okay, but to be real, besides all that poetic mumbo-jumbo that I wrote for my website, Adventureman Dan is just my online name. It's my YouTube name, my pen name when I write for magazines. It's me. So who am I? I'm Daniel Byrne, just a normal guy who's super passionate about a lot of different things and needed to bundle it up into a consolidated idea and the persona, and that is Adventureman Dan. On any given day, I'm really out there just trying to pursue any passion I might have. It might be kiteboarding, sailing, backpacking around the world, van life as I travel, surfing, free climbing, bouldering, ocean cooking, and making my own sushi, climbing, and swimming waterfalls, paddleboarding, free diving, wakeboarding, or whatever catches my attention at the time, or as I like to say, calls to me. Something that really drives me to get out there, off my butt, off the couch, and go see what's over the horizon. Now, most of what I'm known for is based around the water, usually spearfishing, and over the past 2 years, now sailing. But how did a regular guy born in Vermont, raised in upstate New York, end up all over the world living out his dream day by day? Well, to answer that, we're going to go way back to where I think it all started, back in 2014. Now, if you've seen my YouTube channel trailer, it does a pretty good job of giving you a highlight montage of similarly what I'm about to go over, but this is going to be much more in-depth, and I'll probably add a few things I wouldn't to a video. So, going back in time to December of 2014, a friend of mine gave me a GoPro Hero action camera for my birthday. I was 22 at the time and had been spearfishing on and off for about 2 years, but was always interested in the filming aspect of it. I had seen a few other YouTubers and it just really captured my imagination because they could tell a story that really nobody else could about this alien environment where you go hunting and then you bring back, food for everybody. It was unreal. So when I got this camera, I was pretty excited to say the least. That month, my friend and I took a trip into Big Sur, California. If you're not familiar, it's this rugged stretch of coastline in central California. There's really not a whole lot there. The cliff sides just drop right down into the Pacific Ocean, but it can be just fantastic for spearfishing. So we drive all the way up there from San Diego, and the first night, just before the sun goes down, I come out of the water with probably 6 or 7 rock cod. A delicious eating fish, very dumb, very easy to catch, but these ones were really good size. Meaning I probably had more than enough for the trip now. I was going to put it into my cooler and ice it up, and then I'd be able to take it back home with me. But we ended up meeting like 3 or 4 of these families at this park, and they had all these tortillas and taco supplies, but no meat. Somebody forgot it. But they see me coming out of the water, and one thing led to another, and we're doing this huge dinner. Everybody's helping out. I'm filleting the fish. Somebody's cutting up the cilantro and the tomatoes, and it just ended up being this really great night of probably about 15 of us together eating tacos. And at the time, I didn't really think much of it. I was just like, wow, what a cool experience. Got to share my fish with everybody. But looking back on it, it was a really big moment. It was the first time I felt this real passion, this real joy, and it sparked a lot in me of feeding other people something so simple, so basic, but feeding them out of the ocean what I had caught. So the next day, I'm kind of all out of fish because we ate it all the night prior. But the next day we go up a little further north to a different spot. I scale down the cliffs, go spearfishing, and I had an even better day this time. I got a ling cod, some nice rock cod, and a bunch of mussels. So it was a really nice haul. And as I came up out of the water, I'm rock climbing literally out of the ocean, and this guy is looking at me. And he's a little scruffy looking, not homeless, but he was a hippie. He's a good guy, but he was a hippie. And it turned out he was volunteering at this library called the Henry Miller Library. Him and just about everybody else there was a vegan, and they were all practically starving. Nothing against the establishment that they were working for, it was a setup they had, but let's just say that their diet was severely missing any protein. And what they immediately saw from me was somebody who wasn't just going to the store and getting, food that way, but somebody who got what I like to call organic free range fish and, mussels and everything else. So they invite me back to their quote home, which ended up being tents around the grounds of the library. And I made dinner for probably another like 10 people. But this time it was much more involved. It was much more, these people really appreciated the fish and everything that I was bringing. And it was just delicious too. It was a fantastic meal that everybody was contributing to. Some people had couscous and kale and was a kombucha, so kind of some of your stereotypical hippie staples and whatnot. But it was a really good time, and even though we're all from the same country, it was a little bit of like a cultural exchange. They had never met somebody who had spearfished before, so it wasn't just about the fish. None of them had been into the Pacific Ocean there off of Big Sur because it's freezing. So I was able to teach them a lot about what was actually going on in the water there, all because of that GoPro that I had. So there I am, sitting down for this huge feast. Everybody's talking. I've got my laptop up, and I'm showing them footage of the fish that I'm spearing, that they're eating right now on the plate, and they are just loving it. Many of these people at the table hadn't had meat in like 10 years or something. I might be exaggerating, but you get the idea. It was a really, really cool thing, and that kind of solidified. I was like, okay, this is something I'm really passionate about. It's something I really want to keep doing. So eventually my week vacation in Big Sur comes to an end, and I have to go back down to San Diego. Unfortunately, I didn't have any fish to bring back with me because we kept going back to the library, and it was just way more fun. I think there's a quote that goes, food tastes much better when it's shared, and it's something that I've been a big proponent of ever since. So I get back to San Diego, and I have this kind of revitalized passion for spearfishing because I see it more than just shooting fish and making a little fish dinner for the night. I see it as much more now. So I invest in a better GoPro that same week, as well as I get a bigger gun, I get a better mask, a few other things, just so I can be more into the sport and what ends up really being a lifestyle. I start having many more friends over, trying to cook bigger, more elaborate meals, getting as many sides going as I can. I went a little overboard, but it was a lot of fun. And then in the months to follow, I might get, a few days off or a week off, and I just shoot right up to Big Sur, right back to that library. I had a lot of friends. The volunteers would kind of change out there. There was a couple that would stay, and I got to know them really well, and they got to really enjoy when I come up and would feed everybody. As well, I'd be showing them this video footage that wasn't just raw anymore. I finally had started editing a little bit, so I was progressing slowly but surely. I even went up there one time for Christmas and fed everybody for like a Christmas dinner. That was really great, but by far the most memorable trip up there was me, my buddy, and another friend. We went up and we had an invite to do like an ocean feast for this rock band that was going to be playing there. And that was just like you would think it would be. It was something else. We're in the middle of the redwood forest, on the cliffs of Big Sur. Everybody's eating fish, and it was some of the best mussels I'd ever had, actually. And it was just an amazing time, an amazing experience. Everybody was dancing afterwards, and something else. So I get back to San Diego after all this, and I'm trying to push myself in spearfishing even further, but I'm not really sure how to. So I joined a spearfishing club, which I learned some things from, not as much as I had hoped, that's for sure. But we ended up doing a trip out to Santa Catalina Island, just off of LA, and that was fantastic. While most of the other guys that went on the trip just drank the entire time, I would just be solo diving off the back of Catalina, and had some really fantastic experiences diving throughout the kelp, the sunlight coming through, shooting big calico bass. It was outstanding. So now I'm starting to see, okay, so spearfishing is really a fantastic sport and lifestyle when you go traveling. So where else can I go to? Because I want to get new footage, I want to see new things, I want to spearfish different fish I haven't before. It really starts to get into my blood. So I get an offer to go with a few buddies to Baja on the Sea of Cortez side. And that really said a lot for me. I went there, shot a lot of grouper, and there was just a lot of new things around that was really interesting to me. Being that I had been used to diving in Northern California, my eyes were used to seeing fish that were camouflaged and things like that. So I was able to also get scorpion fish and a few other species the other guys hadn't figured out that were there, as well they were teaching me about the grouper and other fish around the area. So I do a few more trips like this. We would always get a pretty good amount of fish while we were spearfishing there, and then we would do a big filleting party, and we'd package it all up and bring it back home. So I was able to freeze it and then do big dinners again for my friends and everything. Then I started spearfishing the Pacific side of Baja, pretty far up north. So the species weren't that different, but I did find some really good spots for halibut and such, and again, bringing it back home. But now I felt like I was kind of running out of space. I was running out of West Coast to really go explore. As well, at that time, I found myself at this major crossroads in my life for a number of personal reasons, and I really wasn't doing that well. Spearfishing very much so became a coping mechanism for me, I found, a very healthy one. I'd look forward to going on the dive trip. I'd look forward and have fun to just seeing where I could go. So when I broadened my horizon to not just the West Coast of North America, but the whole world, well, now I had some really cool options in front of me. I remember asking a lot of people and got a lot of feedback, and many people were recommending for me to go to places like the Philippines and Indonesia, Thailand, kind of some of those places which were also synonymous with backpackers and everything. But I really wanted to go to places that were a little more off the grid. And one place I had heard was amazing, but didn't really know anybody had been to yet, was New Zealand. Way out there in the South Pacific, New Zealand spearfishing is probably best known for what they call kingfish, but in Southern California, we call yellowtail. The proper name is yellowtail amberjack, a type of amberjack that's just delicious. In Southern California, when the summertime comes around, everybody goes out for yellowtail. It's a great fish to shoot and fantastic for eating raw. In a sushi restaurant, it's called hamachi. So New Zealand has the biggest of all the yellowtail. They hold all the records, and it's technically a slightly different species, but that fish is what I set my gear to. You know, I brought with me a Rife Euro 120 enclosed track, which ended up being the best all-around gun that I could possibly bring. As well as I brought a couple other guns I ended up having to just ship back. You know, they weren't really that great for what I was trying to do, as well as they added a lot of weight to my gear. So there was going to be a lot of lessons learned. I had only really started traveling recently internationally when I went into Baja, so I didn't have many stamps on my passport, but I needed to get a handle of what I was getting myself into, not just for spearfishing, because that was actually a bit of an afterthought, but more just for traveling. So I discovered this website called Couchsurfing. It's kind of like a Facebook. You make a profile, and then you can host people or be hosted by other people. It's all free. You're not supposed to charge anybody or anything like that, but it was exactly what I needed. So I figured out pretty quickly that the people who get hosted are those who have good references, and you get references by being hosted, which can be difficult, or by hosting people, which can be very easy to find people to host when you live in, say, San Diego, like I did. So I was hosting somebody every week. I would go male, female, just to keep it even, and I was trying to get as big a spread on different countries as I could. Eventually even getting somebody from New Zealand, which was pretty tough because it's a small country and not a ton of travelers around. But I host all these people, get a ton of references from them, and now I sort of have credit in a way to go and get hosted myself whenever I'm somewhere. And this, of course, would always be free, great for that backpacker budget, and I was on a tight budget for this trip. So I have really only just set my destination, Auckland, New Zealand, not the capital, but the largest city in New Zealand, and I was going to fly into there, and that's it. I didn't have any other plans. I was just going to go by the seat of my pants and see what could happen, which in hindsight actually worked really well for me. A lot of people like to have a set itinerary, you know, where they're going to stay and everything, but I literally packed like a tent and decided, hey, you know what, if I can't find a hostel or a hotel or get hosted, I'm just going to urban camp for a night, you know? I really just wasn't afraid of it. New Zealand's a super safe country, so I wasn't really worried about any sort of crime or anything. And so I packed up everything that I needed, got all my other affairs settled in the US, and was like, okay, I'm going to travel around the world for 6 months. That was the original plan. See what happens, and if I need to, just fly back home. I was just trying to go west as I could around the world. I was thinking about the Philippines after New Zealand and this and that, but it was all a super vague plan. So I get everything set, and about 10 days before I was supposed to fly out to New Zealand, and by the way, flights to New Zealand from anywhere pretty much are not cheap. But 10 days out, I'm supposed to fly, and I go to the doctors, and I forget how, as I've been having really bad nosebleeds and things like that, and they find a tumor about the size of a grape, just below my brain, sort of in my nasal cavity, really. And it was definitely a bit of a shock, and I just looked at the doctor and I said, all right, what are the odds that it's cancer? And he's like, very, very low. He's like, but this is still really serious. And I'm like, okay, yeah, no, totally. I leave in 10 days. And for me, my mental state was really at a bad spot where I knew I needed this. I knew I needed to get out and refresh my perspective on life. So he wasn't happy. And maybe it was because of the time frame I gave him, or maybe it was to teach me a lesson, but him and another pretty muscular male doctor, they did a biopsy with a pair of forceps that they just stuck up my nose. I mean, they sprayed some lidocaine up there, but I can tell you right now, it was one of the worst feelings ever as they pinched and tore something that had nerves out of my nasal cavity. It was a memorable experience, to say the least. What was even more memorable, though, was actually when they told me they needed to get another piece. So, yeah, that was fun. So after I get done with that, I go in for an MRI. Same day, the woman there told me I was one of the luckiest people ever, 'cause she'd never seen somebody get a same-day MRI. And after I told her why I was in there and what had just happened, she goes, maybe you're not so lucky. But anyway, so I go in, I get the MRI, and a couple days later they say, all right, it doesn't seem like it's cancerous, but you should still get this removed, just because of where it is. And I said, okay, thank you. I'll see you guys in 6 months. I'll be back in 6 months. I'm going to go around the world. And that was my plan. I flew out, had a ton of gear with me, a ton of luggage, landing in Auckland, New Zealand in late February of 2016. Taking the bus into the city, I was asking people hey, so where are you staying? What's the deal here? Where's a good place to stay? And they're like, what do you mean? You flew into Auckland with no plans? And I was like, yeah, no, I'm going to see how it works out. It ended up really being just fine. And just before I had left, I had made contact with several New Zealanders who were really happy to help with hosting me and taking me out diving and whatnot. So I was pretty excited. A few days after being in the city, I went up to the Northland around Whangarei, met a guy named Peter Burt who was just the best. The guy hosted me probably for almost or more than a month throughout my time in New Zealand. He even let me use his vehicle while I was there, and I told him, I was like, hey, I haven't driven on the left side of the road before, but super cool guy, took me out diving with him, got my first fish with him, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And the trip kind of picked up this tempo pretty quickly. I ended up getting my own camper van and took that around. It was just a minivan outfitted for a backpacker, but it was all I needed. I was able to keep all my gear in there. I had a pretty comfortable bed inside, and I could kind of cook on it. It was perfect, and I learned a lot from it. And I'll harp back on this again later, but in my opinion, a backpacker minivan is the single best way to see a country. And I mean dollar per dollar, for those of us that can't afford hotels. So I decided I would take the minivan all the way up to the furthest northernmost point of New Zealand, Cape Reinga. Had some pretty cool adventures there, and just started working my way down. If I saw there was a storm coming, I would just keep driving to a different section of New Zealand. I'd meet other backpackers along the way, mostly Germans. There's a lot of German backpackers around the world, and specifically in New Zealand. But I'd meet them, and they'd see my spear gun or something, and they'd be like, "What the heck is this thing?" And I'd feed them. It really became a great time. It was probably my favorite time that I spent backpacking around the world. That, and I was still very fresh at it. I still had a lot of energy, and so I started traveling down the Northland of New Zealand. And I remember I eventually got to the Coromandel Peninsula, this huge peninsula that juts out from the east coast of New Zealand. And I go out there, end up meeting a few DOC, which is kind of like park rangers, and they helped me out a ton. They gave me local intel, and one of them, Frederick, thank you, Frederick, even gave me, or lent me his kayak for a day or two. And that was outstanding. I mean, complete strangers were helping me. They just saw this passion, I think, that I had at the time, this wide-eyed kid who, didn't really know what I was doing most of the time, but I was having a great time doing it. And so So I'm at this campsite. I go out the first day and I get some fish. I think I got some lobster, and I'm sharing it with other people at the camp and getting some photos with them. It's a ton of fun. And then the next day, I end up going out again, but this time with Frederick and a friend of his, and I shoot a pretty good size. It was my biggest yellowtail at the time. And then the next like hour, I think I shoot an even bigger one, and they're like, "All right, we got to go in." So we go in, and again, I feed a ton of people. None of it goes to waste, which is just outstanding. But then on the third day, the conditions were so-so, but I've never let that bother me. I had the kayak for one more day, so I decided, hey, I've speared plenty of fish. I could, stand to eat some chicken for the next day or two. Maybe today I'll go out and just try to get some footage of yellowtail swimming, in a school or something. That would be really cool, and not even take the shot. That's kind of where I was at. These fish, by the way, were, in the 30, 40, 50 pound range. I would never have held the shot on that in California, but New Zealand proved to be a whole different game in that, where you can go out and shoot 50-pound yellowtail fairly frequently. And just from a kayak, not even from, an expensive center console or something. So this was really special to me. So I go out the third day, and I'm out there for a couple hours. It was like raining and stuff. The water visibility wasn't good. I wasn't seeing anything. I literally went up in the kayak at one point, got out of the water, sat up in the kayak, and took a nap. But I go back in. I'm on the last kind of what I've got for the day of energy, and this massive school of yellowtail comes up. I mean, it's just huge. And so I dive into it with the intention of just getting footage, but then I see a really big one, and I couldn't not pull the trigger. I had a great shot lined up. I knew it was going to be a holding shot. I did not really accurately estimate how big the yellowtail was, but it didn't entirely matter because I had clipped my float line to the kayak. So I could have speared a marlin, and I would have been just fine. But the only downside over here is I wasn't quite sure the depth of the water. My float line extended down when it was stretched to about, just under 80 feet. So I didn't want to have to free dive that solo and be tired. So I had a really big motivation to keep them out of the rocks and everything. As well, both days prior, I had to deal with sharks trying to steal the fish. So that was also a really big consideration of mine. It ended up being this huge battle where I'm handlining this thing, and I got some fantastic footage of it. I end up hauling this thing up into the boat. Other fishermen come over, and they're rooting me on. It was amazing. It was hands down the highlight of the trip. Made even better by the fact that we were eating it right there. I cleaned off the stainless steel fillet station, and I was making sashimi for everybody. Little kids were even coming over, and their parents letting them eat some, and even the little kids were like, "Oh, it's so good. Everybody loves it." So it was this great experience. And then to add even more on top of it, I had great photos, great video, and this ended up launching me as a writer. I had already written a little bit for a free magazine because he saw my blog post, my Facebook post. But this story was a really good one, and I knew it. So I presented it to several different magazines. They all wanted to publish it, but one magazine in particular took an interest in not just the story, but me as the resident writer for them, as their first resident spearfishing writer. So I decided to write for the New Zealand Bayfisher magazine as their first ever resident spearfishing writer. And this also gave more purpose to my trip than before. I now had some great momentum from, that week of spearing the big fish and everything, and more people were getting a hold of me on my Adventureman Dan Facebook page, which really is what allowed me to do not just this trip, but everywhere else going on further. I would post out where I was going to be going, and different people would get a hold of me, and I would just go meet them, having no clue who they were. I'd go out on the boat with them, and we'd have an amazing time. I'd get more footage, I'd get more fish, and this cycle kept sort of repeating in a montage way as I look back on it now. So I had a 3-month visa, but I pretty quickly decided to extend that. I ended up staying in New Zealand for a total of 5 months. Absolutely loved my time there. Got to know a lot of people. Dove just about the entire North Island, specifically on the East Coast side. As well, I got to go down to the South Island a couple times, and even went as far as Stewart Island, which is even further south in the South Island. So I really felt like I got my money's worth out of New Zealand, that's for sure. But winter was coming into full swing, and I had already speared just about every species there, so I felt like I was maxing out a little bit and that need to do something new again. So I sold my minivan and took a flight over to Sydney, Australia. I continued to post on Facebook everywhere I could that had any relevance to spearfishing in Australia, and I'd just say, hey, Adventureman Dan's coming this way. Anybody around, anybody able to take me with you guys on a dive trip, I can happily pay for gas. And this allowed me to never pay for a fishing charter, which would have cost a ton of money. I would have been flat broke in no time. But also, I got to learn the species a lot better. There's no way I would have speared half the fish that I did, if even that, if it wasn't for the locals who taught me so much. And they brought me to some of their favorite spots, which I took as a really special thing. As well, and I'll say it again, hosting me helped me save a ton of money that I would have otherwise spent on a hostel, which I can't stand hostels anymore. So this traveling lifestyle that I was developing for myself was certainly tiring, but at the end of the day would be highly rewarding. So from Sydney, I took a bus down to, I believe, Batman's Bay. A guy hosted me out of there. It was super nice, and I got to do a couple of dive trips around there with him and with some of his friends. Didn't really spear a whole lot. It wasn't really the season for much as it was winter down there. But I ended up taking a bus back up out of there, going all the way north, I think as far as like Kingscliff, near Brisbane. We drove with some guys there and just kind of continued up around Bundaberg in through to Cairns. And Cairns was as far north as I went. I just saw the water getting a lot warmer, and there wasn't really any other good places that were populated enough that I'd be able to find some other spearos to go out with. I had gotten to dive the Great Barrier Reef and other spots off of it, speared a lot of new fish, so I felt like I had maxed out there. So again, I took a flight over now to Perth, Western Australia, where I got to link up with Barry Paxman, one of the legends of spearfishing, and he was just an outstanding guy, hosted me, got to go spearfishing with him. Unfortunately, the weather was very rarely good, so we only made it out for 2 dives together, but those 2 dives were outstanding. I saw some huge fish, speared some huge fish, put a spear into what probably would have been my biggest fish, this Samson fish, probably around 40 kilos, but it just took me for a ride. The footage is hilarious. I can't wait to upload that. But yeah, so I got a few dives in with him and then had to head up further to Exmouth to try again to spear some new species and whatnot. And it was just a really cool location. It juts out into the Indian Ocean. You get a really interesting mix of warm water species, but apparently there's no ciguatera on the coral there. I would say that Western Australia, along with the Sea of Cortez, are probably 2 of the best spearfishing places in the world that aren't really known or don't really get hit as much as a lot of other places. So I had a few dives there, but wasn't able to really get out with any good spearfishermen up there. So I had to eventually leave Australia. You only get 3 months to spend in the country, and unlike New Zealand, they do not extend. You pretty much have to take a flight out and fly right back in, which I was like, you know what? I gotten my money's worth out of Australia. Ton of people hosted me, made a lot of new friends, was very grateful for my experiences, but it was time to move on. So I'm looking where to go next, and I realized there was a trend with New Zealand and Australia, both very safe countries, both kind of similar to the United States of America in their culture, at least, music and everything else. So I wanted to go someplace more exotic. I was talking to one guy and potentially going to be going up to Mozambique, I think, and just started looking over towards Africa in general. And then one night I stumbled on this guy's Facebook page, just his personal Facebook page, but it shows all these different species: marlin, sailfish, giant trevally, snook, and other species I wasn't even aware of. And I look at where he is and it says South Africa, and I'm like, I don't know anything about South Africa. What's going on over there? So I started doing some research, and after a little bit I was like, you know what, let's see if maybe he'd be up for taking me under his wing a little bit. The guy's name was Jean-Pierre Jordan. Just a really cool guy and a really good diver. I learned a lot spearfishing with him. But yeah, so I sent him a message, and of course he said yes. I think he kind of took me under his wing for about a month. I also got to dive with his dad, Kus, and it was probably some of the most difficult diving I've done. We did most of it about 100 miles south of the Mozambique border on the east coast of South Africa. There were tons of sharks. I had my second great white encounter there. Didn't quite get it on footage, but speared several new species, including wahoo and giant trevally, two that I really wanted to for quite a while. But the diving there was, like I said, really difficult. I fell asleep in the water at one point, I think just before I pulled the trigger on like a 22 kilo or 23 kilo giant trevally. So it was really cool in that. But eventually I had to move on from there as well. I just kind of spearfished what I could. It felt like I'd seen what I could, even had a fairly close encounter with a leopard. But it was time for me to move on. So I took a flight over to Cape Town. Thanks to the people I had met over on the East Coast, I had a few contacts to go off of, but now I was staying in hostels and really getting into that hostel life. And what I mean by that is getting woken up at 3 a.m. by some drunk German teenager usually. So I was getting pretty over just this whole traveling thing. I'd been traveling around the world for I think about a year at this point. It was tougher over here to get out for dive missions. I didn't have my own vehicle. I wasn't traveling around as freely as before. But I managed to get out for 3 dives separately down to Cape Agulhas. It's the southernmost tip of Africa, a really cool area. I had my 3rd great white encounter while spearfishing there. Ended up spearing, funny enough, quite a bit of yellowtail amberjack. These ones weren't usually over, probably not much more than 30 pounds, if that. But because I was going back to a hostel, and a hostel that I knew with people there that I now knew, I ended up really perfecting these huge sushi dinners. And they became, the thing going on around the hostel. The first one, I think I had like 10 people. Second one, like 15. And I think by the third, there was give or take like, 20, 25 people. It was an amazing experience where I really perfected sharing my catch, sharing the footage, sharing the experience, having other people help me with it. So it was this great collection. And I mean, at the table would be 10 plus countries, so everybody's speaking a little bit of English usually. And it was just a fantastic time. So from there, I flew to Dubai. It was a pretty cool week I spent over there. I stayed in this really strange hostel run by these Eastern Europeans on the 77th floor of this condo, I guess. And it was kind of a derelict place, the hostel, but it was inside of a really, really nice condo. And it was all quasi-legal or something. It was a strange setup, but it was cheap and the view was amazing. I remember one night, I'm in this bunk bed built out of 2x4s, and I look out the window and I can see the Burj Al Dubai, a 5 or 6 star hotel. I can see the world, which is this collection of islands, man-made islands, meant to look like the different continents from the world. And it was just a really, really cool experience. I did a few other things around Dubai, but most everything required spending more than $100. And not only was I running low on cash, but that's just not my style, not something I really enjoy. I think the last thing I did there was I went snowboarding for the day at the indoor snowboarding park, and that was really cool. That was really something. Seeing all these other Arabs there, and they're just riding the chairlift because I think that's an experience. And for them it was, but for me getting to just do this little downhill thing, and I was trying to pull some tricks, and I was pretty rusty, so it wasn't that great, but it was a lot of fun. So I flew out of there to Frankfurt, Germany next, and from Frankfurt I just went to each major city around Europe in about a month. I'd spend like 2 or 3 days there, take 6 a.m. flights, and this was during the winter in Europe. And I learned pretty quickly that I traveled Europe wrong. I completely did it wrong. I was so tired, I was barely enjoying anything. And so I went from Frankfurt to Amsterdam to London to Dublin to Paris to Rome to Prague, Hanover, Berlin, back to Frankfurt, and then flew out. And it was cool. I saw all the major sites, got a photo in front of them, but I really felt like I was just checking marks on the box. I didn't feel like I was authentically traveling like I had before, in New Zealand, Australia, and even South Africa. So it was a good lesson for me, just a bit of a hard one. And then kind of as a funny last experience in Europe, when I went to fly out of Frankfurt for New York City, I would always get pulled aside for, quote, random inspections. I think it's because I was military age and, I had a pretty bushy goatee going on at the time, I guess. I don't know. But I would always get pulled out of line. So I get pulled out for this random bomb inspection, and they're checking my laptop, and I get called over to a special little spot. A couple German police officers come over, and they're pretty armed, and they look pretty pissed at me. And they tell me that my laptop has tested positive for explosive residue, which means, it could be a part of a bomb or something. And I'm just tired and annoyed at this point. I understand that this could be a serious problem, but I'm like, you know what, this is ridiculous. And so they start asking me questions. They're like, what do you do for a living? Or what are you here for? And I tell them, I'm like, well, I'm a spearfishing writer and photographer, which was technically true. And I don't speak German, but I could tell they said bullshit. And I'm like, no, really. So I pull out a magazine that I'm on both pages of, this really nice magazine spread. And it's me holding a couple, fish and lobster or whatever it was. And the expressions on their face completely changed, total 180. And the one guy, he's like, oh, look at this, to his other police guard friend. And now I start laughing a little bit, and I'm like, hey, can I take a photo of you? And it's like one of my favorite photos, this guy like holding the magazine all proud and happy or whatever. And, and it was just kind of funny. So anyway, so I fly back to New York City. I see my grandmother, and it just felt good, honestly, being back in even New York City. The bus driver was rude, but it was kind of nice being back in my home country where I knew how everything worked. If anything happened, I have a support network much closer. It definitely made me realize how 14 months solo backpacking had definitely taken its toll, and I wasn't even enjoying traveling towards the end of it. So there was a lot of positive lessons learned as well as a lot of negative lessons learned. But after that, I fly into San Diego and immediately begin work on my next big adventure. So even while I was traveling, I think in New Zealand is where I first came up with it. When I was diving Stewart Island, further south in the South Island of New Zealand, it was snowing and everything, and I decided, it'd be really cool is to go spearfish Alaska. It's such a wild place, but I don't ever hear about anybody going into the water there. Specifically, though, I wanted a world record. I had read up a little bit about it. I met some guys that held records and saw that there was a few records that were missing from there, and there still is some records that nobody has tried to claim anything on. At the time, it was the king salmon and the Pacific halibut. Nobody had submitted one. I'm sure somebody had speared them, but nobody had submitted them. So this was a really big motivator for me. So I spent the next, I think, 2 or maybe even 3 months getting ready for this trip. I, again, sold even more things I didn't need or wasn't using, that I had in storage from before. Did some work and saved up enough money to buy a used V8 pickup truck with 4-wheel drive and a tow-behind RV camper trailer. This thing was, I think, 21 feet overall, but had a living space of 17 feet long. But to me, it was a little home on wheels. I was really excited for it. I thought it would be a lot better than the van life because I'd have an actual bed and could really live in it, not just out of it. It ended up being a lot more work towing it and whatnot, and I don't regret it, but I probably wouldn't jump at the opportunity to go RVing again. I would probably immediately go back to the van life, though, just because of its ease and convenience. So anyway, so I prep all this stuff, and I leave from San Diego. Actually, it was Imperial Beach, which is the furthest southwest point in the continental U.S. So I left from as far south as I could go, heading all the way north. I go through Southern California. I get up into Central California, do a little bit of spearfishing up there, see some friends, continue on up along the coast, go through San Francisco, go through and over the Golden Gate Bridge. That was really special. Continuing through Northern California, did some spearfishing. At the very northernmost spots of Northern California, I met some really, really cool people. They took me freestyle jet skiing in a river, and then I ended up going diving with them and got abalone, got some trophy abalone. The year before, they ended up closing the season, which seems to be permanently on abalone now. So that was fantastic. Went through Oregon and just had a lot of fun the whole way up, and eventually through Washington and then into British Columbia. I really liked British Columbia. I kind of knew that I would already from what I'd seen, though. But the road trip through there was just magical. the road actually going all the way up the coast, and it has to go inland once you go into British Columbia, but it was really well paved, really smooth. And I mean, you're always near rivers, and then all of a sudden you're going through mountains and valleys and through tunnels, and it was just incredibly picturesque. So we get all the way up through there, go as far as I can, and then I hop on a ferry. So I had to take my my big rig, as I thought it was, RV and pickup truck onto this ferry. Ended up being a lot of other people with far larger RV setups than me, so it kind of gave me some perspective at that point. But I take the RV up and we go to one of the stops in Southeast Alaska, where I had actually had a host who was going to kind of help me out from the area on couch surfing. So couch surfing that I had kind of maintained and cultivated throughout the years was again paying dividends for me. And I really want to stress this to everybody who wants to go travel around the world. Couch surfing is amazing. You got to put some work into it, but it's monetarily basically free. So anyway, this couple ends up helping me out quite a bit, and I would be doing these big seafood dinners for them while I was up there. But I ended up solo diving Alaska, which was tough. I'd be getting up at 4 a.m. sometimes, and the sun would already be up because, it was Alaska in the beginning of summertime. But I started out spearfishing, or going for the spearfishing world record on king salmon. And I think it took me 3 weeks before I shot one. It was demoralizing, to say the least. I recognized afterwards that a lot of the other places I've been around the world, the fish weren't so particular to hunt. They were, closer to other fish I'd hunted, but also I'd had that local knowledge, that local help. So in that time, in my frustration, I asked a lot of questions. I was interviewing different people and just trying to find out anything I could, talking to the Department of Fish and Game up there, rereading all the laws and everything, because you can't spear king salmon in rivers. If you could, it'd be easy. It would have been a day one victory, go home, no worries. But what you can do is spearfish near where you think they're going to be going to. King salmon are technically pelagic, I guess, in that, they're out there swimming freely, but most pelagics are pretty dumb, and you can intrigue them to come in closer with flashers, or they're just automatically a curious species, so you'll get them to come in much closer. King salmon, however, have these special rules to them because they're spawning. They don't care even for food or anything. If they see anything that's not, I guess, their destination, they're just going to immediately bolt and go the other way. Plus, the water was often murky, and did I mention that it's Alaska and it's freezing cold. I think I had an old 7mm free dive wetsuit with tons of holes in it. I was using this wetsuit glue every single day. I would just be freezing, and I spent like 8 hours a day in the water. I brought my kayak with me by putting it up on the roof racks of my pickup truck, and did a similar setup that I did when I was in New Zealand, where I connected my float line to the kayak. This let me tow the kayak wherever I was going, so I didn't have to anchor it, but also, if I saw a 500-pound halibut, I could take the shot on that and potentially land it. Man, how cool would that have been? And also a total fantasy, as it turned out. Anyway, so fast forward 3 weeks, I end up finally getting a king salmon. I only actually shot one up there and submitted it. It took a lot of work. It was much more involved than I expected it to be, even though I had done some research on it, but the process was pretty thorough. A big mistake I made, though, was I gilled and gutted the fish, which, took a couple pounds off of it. And that's a whole story for another time, though. But anyway, so I do that, and then I start focusing on the Pacific halibut record. I had not seen any Pacific halibut so far, so I again did some more research and basically found out that they prefer to be closer or more in the ocean, so I had to get a little bit further out of all the fjords and everything that I've been in. And I'm kayaking every day, like I said, about 8 hours, and the spot I needed to get to now was over the horizon, where I could just barely see some of the islands kind of floating in the distance. And I'll never forget that. Standing in this parking lot, just looking out, it's gorgeous, but realizing that I can't go out there and get it. It was like 20 miles each way. I physically could have done it, a kayak in both directions. It would have killed me. But to add on top of that spearfishing, and then on top of that, if I do get a big halibut, I gotta lug that thing back somehow. So I'm doing all this logistics in my head. I'm like, okay, what if I go camping over there? Oh, well, then I got to worry about bears. So I got to bring a gun. I got to do this. I got to do that. And long story short, I just couldn't get out there. And I'd been up in Alaska for a while. It was time for me to move on. But an idea at that point stuck in my head. I'm tired of begging people to go out on their boat. I'm tired of being in hostels. But I need to travel. I need to travel on the cheap. And there's really only one option for that: buy a sailboat. So now I had another major adventure goal, and I knew I wouldn't be able to really sleep or enjoy myself until I achieved it, or at least was working on it. So I traveled all the way back down the coast to Santa Cruz, California. I had lived there for a few years and had quite a few friends there, and a buddy of mine offered for me to live near his place in the redwood forest, just parking my RV there. It would be rent free, and I'd be able to save up money and find work. And that's what I did for a year and a half. I just lived under the redwoods every day, a little afraid a gigantic pine bough was going to pierce through my roof and, catch me in the head or something. But yeah, I mean, it was a really, really tough time, but a good time and chance and place for me to grow. I joined the Santa Cruz Yacht Club, and it was a little tough to actually learn how to sail out of there. But I ended up finding a mentor, and he helped me out tremendously. If it wasn't for him, there's no way I would have bought a decent boat, nor would my boat still be afloat if it wasn't for his lessons and teachings and everything. So I learned how to sail over there and with him. Even got paid to go on a delivery with him from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, all the way up to Newport, Rhode Island, which was a fantastic experience, and let me experience offshore sailing, which at the time I had done none of. And this was really big for me. I needed to know that my body and my mind could handle the rigors of it. And I mean, it was great. It was a great experience. I ended up cooking for everybody. I think I missed one meal out of the entire trip on top of doing watches. So for me, it really solidified, okay, like, you're getting a boat, you're doing this. So once my year and a half was up, I quit my job. Again, sold everything I didn't need, sold the RV especially, got quite a bit of money back for that because I added solar panels to it. So that helped out a ton to put money in the bank for the sailboat. Sold my pickup truck, got a little less for that than I would have wanted. But I bought a very beat up Honda Odyssey minivan, took all but one of the seats out of the back, did a ton of woodworking back there, and made my ideal backpacker minivan. And I loved that thing. It was fantastic. The only thing it didn't have that I really regret was air conditioning. That ended up kind of biting me in the butt later. But anyway, so on the 4th of July of 2018, I officially drove out of there and went all the way up to Lake Tahoe to begin the trip. Had no plans, showed up there, ended up getting a campsite somehow. I forget how I talked my way into it. But had a buddy also come up there, and we watched the fireworks, did a bunch of free climbing, free dove Lake Tahoe, which was a ton of fun. I actually ended up making money on that trip somehow because some people lost their phone, and like a few other like weird things I ended up diving for. I think I found like GoPros and like an Apple Watch as well. So it was a really fun trip. Ate some of the crayfish that are invasive in there, which were really good. And so we traveled on from there just a little bit northwest, I believe, to Truckee, did more bouldering and free climbing, and it was just a fantastic trip. He had to go back down, because he had a job and everything, but I continued onward. I went up to Crater Lake, Oregon, and checked out around there, jumped in, froze my butt off, and then drove out of there, and somebody gave me some advice to head down this highway in Oregon. And it was this like through the woods highway, nothing else around or going on. Ended up being a waterfall every like 5 miles or something. And that was a really, really good little part of the trip. Ended up free climbing and jumping off of one of the bigger falls. There was a hot spring I ended up checking out for a whole day. It was just a great way to start this across the country tour, And so I continued up out of there along the West Coast, kind of looking at sailboats, but pretty quickly it dawned on me that sailboats on the West Coast are probably 2 or 3 times as expensive as the much wider selection on the East Coast. As well, there's really few places that are A, cheap, or B, you can live on your boat and keep your boat at while you're on the West Coast. So despite there being hurricanes over in Florida and the rest of the East Coast, it was a risk that was well worth it to take just because of the financial side of it. So I started, altering my search and planned my trip accordingly. I think I headed up as far north as Seattle and then turned east from there. Went across to, oh man, Yellowstone, which was a fantastic little spot. Again, just staying in the van, cooking out of it. A lot of people would see the van and they'd come over and want to take photos of it. It was a really unique build. I'll have to do a video on that sometime soon. And end up going out of there through the Grand Tetons. I was just spectacular. If you've ever seen it, if you like staring at mountains, it's the place to go. Got lost in Jackson for a little while and got back out of there, back on the road, and headed up across. I think I went through like the Badlands, just saw Mount Rushmore. Just did a real USA summer road trip. It was fantastic. And went all the way across to revisit some of my favorite swim holes in Vermont. These are places where I basically learned how to swim and developed my love for the water and eventually the ocean thereafter. So it was really great, kind of going back to my roots. And then I continue onward all the way up to Acadia National Park. I think that's the furthest north on the East Coast I went. And from Acadia, I started working my way down and really put on the blinders for sailboats. Sailboats. I got into Boston, ended up staying with some people through couch surfing again, which was nice, just to be able to take an actual shower and not just like, oh, hey, a river. That's how I did it most of the time. And so, I went through there, and then the first boat that I went to look at was in Cape Cod. It was a Beneteau that had been on the hard for quite a while. It had 2 cabins. It was below 44 feet, I believe, was my requirement. I wanted a boat that I could solo and single hand pretty easily, but as well I could accommodate other crew members. That was kind of the parameters I was going for, and of course had to be able to sail around the world. So I look at this Beneteau, and it was on the hard, its mast was down, it didn't look that great. My mentor was the one who was like, no, that's a really good boat, you need to take a really good look at that. So I spent like a couple of days in the area actually, and even did some research on the owner. He was a little slow to get back to me, so I said, you know what, I'm going to tell them I'm interested, show them I'm interested, but then kept going down the East Coast a bit. I saw a few more sailboats, wasn't really that taken away by them. The bracket of boats I was looking at was below $30,000, so the brokers that were selling them weren't super motivated because that's really the cheapest a boat can go for while still having a broker. So there are boats that I would have liked to have looked at that the brokers were just lazy and never got back to me. And I continued all the way down. I think I got as far as Norfolk, Virginia. Staying with some Navy buddies, and I get a call from the broker on the boat back in Cape Cod. And this guy's named Stuart. He's this stout, Bostonian style guy. I really respected him though. But man, I mean, he was, no BS about him. And he's like, all right, so you're interested in this boat or not? And I'm like, yeah, no, this is my plan, sail around the world. I'm Adventureman Dan. And he's like, okay, yeah, that's great. And he's like, so what's your offer? Put in an offer. And he kind of rushed me, so I wasn't entirely ready. So I actually gave him a bid about $1,000 less than what I was supposed to, according to my mentor. My mentor having vast knowledge in all of this. He rejected my offer, came back with a counteroffer, and I decided to just stay. I said, you know what? I'm already pretty far down the coast. I've got Florida coming up in, a couple days or a week or so. And once I get into Florida, I'm not coming back up to Cape Cod. I know this. You know this. The market for sailboats down there is huge. There's just a ton of them. So he talked with the seller, and another reason why I did this was because I knew the seller had to sell the boat. I knew there was a lot of push for this. The broker is going to make money no matter what the boat sells for. So he, although working for the seller, had a motivation to sell the boat, more maybe even than the seller himself. So they end up accepting my offer, which was pendant on a sea trial and survey. I drive straight up there. I get a deposit check cut, get everything sorted, and the broker actually ended up letting me stay at his Cape Cod house, which was really nice of him. I was able to get mail sent there. They had an outdoor shower. Oh, I was living the life of luxury, But super nice guy. He ends up helping me close on it, And I mean, he did a great job both for the seller who he was working for and also for me, kind of more as a friend. I still talk to him to this day. Great guy. His name is Stu Roach. His company is Norwood Yacht Sales Incorporated. Great guy, really knows the stuff. Can't stress how much he does not BS around. But anyway, so he helps me out quite a bit, not just in being able to have a place to stay around while we got the boat ready, because it took about a month once I put the deposit in to get the balls rolling and get the boat off the hard into the water, step the mast, all these little things. And the seller had to help me out with this as well. He was a really good guy on it, in all honesty. He was really good for me trying to beat him over the head because I just had a tiny, tiny budget, but I think it worked out for both of us. He was able to sell his boat and be done with it, and I was able to start this new adventure. So I get the boat. Stu even actually helps me learn how to dock the boat, which is the one thing I was by far the most afraid of. I had sailed the boat out in the open ocean plenty of times, and I had brought in smaller sailboats, but I hadn't brought in such a large and heavy boat to a dock before, and there is definitely an art form to it. I'll never forget his advice: only go as fast as you want to hit the dock, which has really saved me so far. I've hit a few things, like anybody who owns a sailboat, but thankfully it hasn't been too catastrophic. So anyway, I buy the boat on September 25th, 2018, and move on to it that same night. For most people, buying a sailboat and moving onto it would be a reduction in living space. But for me, living on the minivan, oh man, I could stand up, I could stretch. It was fantastic. I think the first night I spent on the boat, it blew like 30 or 40 knots. I didn't sleep at all. I'm getting rocked around. Thankfully, the deal I worked out with Stu, I was able to stay on this mooring ball. But I swore I was getting dragged on the mooring ball. I thought the boat behind me was getting closer, and it was all in my head. Good learning experience, good character building stuff. So anyway, so I spend the next, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks prepping the boat for leaving the Northeast. Couldn't stay. It was just going to get colder and colder. I really only changed out the anchor on this boat. It's all it really needed, in my opinion. I had what was called a CQR. Talked to my mentor. He tells me, oh, that stands for can't quite reset. So I said, okay. So we looked at some other anchor styles. And again, big shout out. Don Radcliffe is this guy's name. He doesn't do this professionally. He just helped me out. And he helped me out tremendously. I wish I had been able to find mentors like him for other aspects of my life. But thankfully, I found him for this one, because sailing and getting into the ocean environment like this, the learning curve is steep. And if you make a mistake, it might not just be the last mistake for you, it might be the last mistake for your boat, or even worse, last mistake for somebody else. So thankfully, I learned a lot of lessons ahead of time. So I changed out the anchor. I had my parents come down for a weekend. They loved it. Went to a yacht club because I had reciprocity through Santa Cruz Yacht Club. It was this really great, couple weeks or so. I fly a buddy out from California, and he was my first crew member, Jeff from Santa Cruz. And the only crew member I've ever had that I actually knew, before I had them on as crew. So we leave out of Cape Cod. I have very little idea of what I'm doing. I am certainly making it up as I go. But the good news is a sailboat like mine is a Beneteau, ideally, 38 feet long, has a 5,000-pound cast iron keel. You can't flip it. You can't really sink it. It's kind of indestructible. You could wreck the sails. You can do all these things to it. It's mostly just going to be noisy and uncomfortable. And there was this quote I kept running through my head, especially on the first day, which is, the boat can take more than the captain can. And that might not be true on some other boats, but I knew for a fact the broker, the surveyor, my mentor, they'd all told me this was a seriously seaworthy boat. So I had that kind of going in as a little bit of mental fortitude. So we sail out the first day, probably one of the worst storms I've ever been in, We make it, I think, like probably 50 miles. I really didn't have any thought in me of let's turn back. There was never really a mindset for me. So we go into a pretty, I don't know if I want to call it a squall, because it was pretty cold up there, but we go into this storm, and I'm having a hard time seeing a boat length in front. I had full sails up. We're trying to do a reef, and we're trying to drop and all this other stuff, and learned a good lesson about reefing your sails right then and there. But I end up instead looking at the charts, and I'm like, okay, I got an idea, and I cut us behind an island, and the reprieve behind that island was instant and a really nice feeling. So we get the sails down, and I'm like, you know what, I guess we'll use the motor. At that time, I was really, and I kept being for quite a while, really a purist about just using the sails, don't use the motor. I end up realizing later on that my Volvo diesel engine just sips diesel like it's nobody's business. So really motoring whenever it's not correct to sail is just fine, instead of just tacking all day back and forth. So we end up motoring into Cutty Hunk and anchoring, or well, actually using the mooring balls there. And that was kind of like the first, like, okay, we made it. And it was rough. The storm raged for like 2 or 3 days. And we tried to actually stick our nose out and go out to sea at one point, and we just got our butts kicked. It was miserable. Looking back on it, I'm like, what was I doing? So we go straight back into the safety of Cutty Hunk, and the dockmaster finally comes out because the storm, lets up. And it was like $35 a night for a mooring ball. The first time, and it actually ends up being like one of the last times I pay for a mooring ball. But he comes out and he tells us it's $35 a day. And we'd already been there for I think 2 or 3 days. And he just tells me it was for that one day because he didn't know I'd been there the whole time. And I'll never forget him going, yeah, you won't believe it, but this morning, just before you guys came in, some guy left out of here and actually went out in the storm. And I'm just thinking, like, well, that's me. But I'm thinking, oh, yeah, that crazy, intrepid man out there, huh? So I gave the man his $35 for a mooring ball in the off season, and all was well. So we leave out of there, and the next day we sailed. We were supposed to sail to Block Island, but we were doing really well. We had some music playing, the morale was high, the winds were right. We're on a beam reach, I think. Ended up going to a close haul, but it was all good. And we end up going all the way into Connecticut. So now we're actually a day ahead of schedule, which is really nice. And I think around that time I decided, no schedules, just sail when you can. The ocean doesn't go by schedule. So there's a lot of these little lessons that I had to learn. And pretty much every single day I'd be calling my mentor. Maybe I'd have a problem, or maybe just a chat, all these things. Maybe let him know that, hey, I'm still alive, still doing it. But anyway, so Jeff and I sail down. We go through Long Island Sound. I decided we'd go through New York City instead of going around the Sound, just so that way, if we needed to, we'd have places and harbors to go into. And that ended up being a really cool experience. We motored right into New York City, rounded the corner, went all the way up to 79th Street Boat Basin. They had a mooring ball there for $25 a night. Jeff found it online and said, like, hey, we got to go do this. So we go around New York City, and it was just the best feeling ever. All these skyscrapers, and everything's looming over us, and there we are on a boat. It was a really, really cool moment for me. And Jeff had never seen New York City before. It was his first time seeing the city. So it was this really cool experience. We get up there, we get probably the best mooring ball they had. It was pretty rolly in there. A freighter, I guess, would come by in the night, and you just get rocked out of your bed. It only happened once or twice, but yeah, so we stayed there for, I think, 4 nights. I met up with some friends, and we went and saw the city quite a bit. It was just a really, really cool time, and a big difference from being out, out on these less populated islands like Cutty Hunk and stuff, now going into New York City, one of the biggest cities in the world. And then being able to sleep right there in front of the city that never sleeps, it was a really cool, really, really cool experience. So we sail out of there, and at this point, our only goal is to get south. We really have no destination, never have. We just want to get south because we are freezing. I think it's into November at this point. We sail straight past New Jersey, don't even stop. We're doing overnight passages now, so that was another first for me, is doing overnight passages with my own boat. Just the two of us, going back and forth on watches. We were sailing through storms and heavy winds and heavy seas that now, as a more experienced captain, I would just say, I'll wait till next week when there isn't these annoying conditions. But at the time, I didn't really know any better, and again, we're freezing our butts off, so we go all the way down. We go into Ocean City, Maryland, and then from there, we make another passage. And we were planning on doing 2 or 3 nights in a row, which would have got us into really warm locations like potentially Florida. We get in front of the Chesapeake, right in front of Virginia there, right in front of Norfolk, and the cheek block on my port side jib sheet starts like crumbling. And I'm like, man, we don't really need it, but like, because the wind's been this way. And then I'm like, wait a minute, the wind can change. It does that. So we go in, end up staying at one of the free docks at Portsmouth, met some other cruisers. It was my first experience with cruisers' hospitality. They were super nice, helped me out with some stuff. Another cruiser helped me repair the cheek block, which was a solid made part. He just drilled through it and made a new one. But anyways, we spent a couple weeks there, and then we take the Intercoastal Waterway down, the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway. And for those of you that don't know, the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway is this connecting series of canals and channels and inlets that stretches officially from this mile marker 0 right there next to Norfolk, Virginia, all the way down around Florida. It technically ends, down in like the Keys and stuff. But it's this really cool waterway that connects almost the entire East Coast, and you could take a rowboat if you wanted to throughout it. So anyway, we continue onward. We get to Elizabeth City, North Carolina, Harbor of Hospitality, and they really lived up to it. They had free docks. They did these meet and greet things. One of the guys from this organization that's just there to help out cruisers even gave Jeff a ride to the airport when he had to finally go back home. He was only able to stay out for a month, so I was then able to start solo sailing. It was my first time. I was definitely pretty nervous, but it all came really easy. And again, pretty quickly I had this feeling of coming into my own as a captain and now as a solo sailor. I'd make some mistakes and, learn from that. But anyway, so I continue onward. I get to Beaufort, North Carolina, and from there I head back out into the open ocean, because the Intercoastal Waterway is great for when it's stormy and whatnot, but you can't really make a whole lot of progress on any given day. You can't sail it at night. You're going to hit something. And if you're solo, you have to be at the helm every 2 seconds. It's like driving on the road. It is exactly what it's like. Imagine a road, but for your sailboat. So cool for certain things, but not cool if you really want to make headway. Again, I'm freezing my butt off. I want to get south. So I head out of there. I think I knock out like 100 nautical miles, starting kind of late in the day through the night, and then that next morning. And in that next morning, I had a broad reach. I'm surfing waves, having some fun. Then I take a minute to go down below and make some breakfast. And again, the autopilot is on, so it's doing a broad reach for the boat, which is probably the most work for the autopilot. And then I hear these beepings, and the next thing you know, I don't have an autopilot anymore. So I'm like, crap, this is no fun. Solo sailing without an autopilot is, if you're trying to do anything more than 20 miles at a time, is a real pain. So I end up sailing in and just coastal hopping for a while until I got to Charleston. And in Charleston, I get some parts and do it all myself. Put in a brand new Raymarine autopilot. It's an Auto Helm 1100 or something. It only goes left and right, and that's all I needed to do, just to hold a course left or right. That's all I want. So I leave out of Charleston before the sun is even up, kind of at the tail end of the storm, hoping to catch just a little bit of it. And I've got with me my second crew member, Jameson from Virginia. He was the first crew member that I posted for, and kind of answered this, hey, if you want to come get some sailing experience, help me bring my boat further south. It wasn't really a glamorous thing. I didn't get a whole lot of response to it, but this guy stepped up, and he was a great crew member, and in a lot of ways paved the way for what would be my future crew members when I now get probably as many as 50 or 70 requests per month sometimes from people who want to come sail with me. But together, the first day we sailed out of there, and I think it was like 33 degrees Fahrenheit, so it'd be like 1 degree Celsius, just 1 degree above freezing, just enough so I couldn't say it was freezing cold. And it was freezing cold as far as I could tell. I froze, miserable sail, but I bring the boat closer to land, ends up being this offshore breeze, so it's really smooth, ends up going to a broad reach, and I think I did like 180 nautical miles in 24 hours, something like that. It was one of the fastest passages I've ever done. But we get into Jacksonville, Florida. We just skip Georgia altogether. We get into Jacksonville way ahead of schedule, like 4 or 5 hours before I thought we were going to. And we get some gas, and then we're like, do you want to keep going? Yeah, let's keep going. So we went from there all the way down to St. Augustine. St. Augustine's probably the most beautiful city that I've ever sailed into. And Jameson paid for us to get a mooring ball so we'd be able to take a shower and stuff at the city marina there. Best shower I've ever had. I'm not sure how they did it, but just beautiful, beautiful shower. When you're a vagabond traveler like I am, you remember these things. So anyway, Jameson gets off after doing what he'd want to do, which was an open ocean passage, because I told him that with the weather coming, it was all going to be out of the south. I was just going to take the ICW down. So he got off, and I just continued onward solo, just anchoring wherever I wanted to as I went down. I got down as far as around Cape Canaveral, met up with some family, had my birthday there, and then took on my third crew member, Steve from Kentucky. Now, this guy was 55. He had a kid who was a little older than me, as well as like 5 other kids on top of that. Probably one of my favorite crew members. Super respectful. Didn't know a whole lot about sailing, but he was like the perfect blank slate. He listened to everything. He was just on top of it. I had to tell him to stop calling me sir at one point. I just thought that was a little too much. But no, he was a great guy, and we got along famously. We had an amazing, I think it was week or 10 days of sailing. I think it was a week. And we sailed from Cape Canaveral around Florida to Cape Coral. I was going to do Christmas with my family there. And every day it seemed we would encounter a pretty major obstacle, and we would overcome it through teamwork and all that other kind of good stuff. So we're sailing down, and we get caught out in front of Jupiter, which is an area I now know, but at the time had never been around. And the storm's getting pretty bad. More than that, it was a northeasterly storm, and the Gulf Stream is kicking up these huge waves. We're not getting anywhere. I think we're going at like 3 miles an hour at this point. It's painfully slow. So I start looking at an inlet to go into, and I see Jupiter Inlet, and I see a lot of warnings on there. So I make some phone calls, I do some research, and I find out it's a bit of a death trap. Long story short, I take it. And it's the closest I've ever come to destroying my boat easily. As we approached into the inlet, I had all my sails down because I didn't want to have to worry about that. Had the motor on, and just as we get up to it, the surf breaks right in the inlet. And I'm talking like 9.5 foot breaking waves. They were huge, so big that I was surfing them with the sailboat. And I mean, the boat got picked up and shot by the wave. And then a second one came as well. It was something else. Steve was up front holding onto the mast like something out of the Odyssey. I was in the back, white knuckling the helm, yelling for him like, "Hey, do you see anything? What's up ahead of us?" And anyway, so we've been getting our butts kicked for hours. We take this wave in, and then all of a sudden it was just perfectly smooth because we were back in the ICW again. So it was a pretty cool feeling. And this sort of, maybe not to this level, but again, we've come across a pretty big hurdle every day. I think at one point we went to leave the ICW at Fort Lauderdale. There was a U.S. Navy attack sub doing maneuvers, so we had to like move around them and everything. And yeah, so we got all the way over to Cape Coral, and I have Christmas with the family there. Steve has already gotten off, and he's with his family for Christmas. So I've got a couple weeks after that where I do a few repairs on the boat. My mentor, Don Radcliffe, came out and actually got to see the boat for the first time, showed him everything, got his opinion on what I should change and shouldn't change, because a lot of people buy a sailboat and then immediately go to work refitting it how they want it for when they sail. But I decided for a number of reasons that I was going to get this boat, sail it, learn it, have fun with it, use it as it was, and then decide what I needed to change on it. So he helped me quite a bit with that. We went through everything on the boat, and it felt really good to have him see the whole boat and then just say, "Yep, it's a boat. I think you got the right one." It was subtle, but it was a really good moment for me. So he ends up flying back to California. I offered for him to sail with me for a bit, but he had things he had to go do back in California. So then I take on my 4th and 5th crew member. I decided I was going to try to see what having 2 more crew members on board was like. So I posted online and interviewed a bunch more people. It was obvious that I was getting more and more interest on this as my photos were coming out and posting online. So I ended up picking up from the airport David from Kansas and Graham from Maryland, my 4th and 5th crew members. And together we sailed from Cape Coral to the Dry Tortugas. It was a really bumpy sail over there just because of how shallow the Gulf is in there. But it was a really unique place, for sure. The Dry Tortugas was a really unique place. I can't say that I particularly liked it just because of how many rules were there. I enjoy nature and the idea of being free, doubly so on a sailboat. You're really free. But the Dry Tortugas is a national park, and understandably, they have to keep it clean and safe for everybody because it gets a ton of people every year. So we anchored there and saw the fort, saw what else was around. There was some coral to go see. It was a very unique place, but I got bored of it. You can't spearfish inside the park there. You can spearfish outside where it's like 90 feet, which I'm not that good of a spear fisherman where I can regularly dive that kind of depth. So we ended up leaving from there, went over to the Marquesas Keys for a few nights. It was the first time I did buddy boating, where I actually started sailing with another boat. I had been having them over for breakfast. They had us over for dinner, and so on. It was this couple with a young daughter, and it was a ton of fun. It was, again, this community of sailing really opened my eyes to sailing being more than just going out there on your boat and being alone, but being out there with other like-minded people. And it's something I'll talk more about again later. But anyway, so both our boats go over the Marquesas Key, and we spend a little bit of time there. I get some fish. We all eat some fish tacos. It was a good time. But then it was time for us to split again. So my boat goes to Key West, and I think they went to some of the other lesser-known keys to be off the grid a little while longer. Now that we weren't really doing as much sailing, we were doing more cruising. Graham got off the boat because he just wanted to get some sea time for getting his captain's license. David, however, was really keen on continuing to sail and travel around and do some more spearfishing and stuff, so he stuck with me. We stayed in Key West for, unfortunately, like a week. I'm not a big fan of Key West, particularly not a big fan if you are sailing there. The anchorage is really bad. There's a lot of people that really are homeless. They just got their hands on a sailboat, and they live there in huge droves. And it really is kind of a stain on the sailing community as a whole, because these guys probably don't know how to sail, but just because they're in sailboats, they give the rest of the sailors and cruisers a bad name. But anyway, I digress. So we're there for a little bit. At the time, I had an anchoring system that basically was my 45-pound Vulcan Rocknet anchor. Love it, great, never had a problem, always holds. And then I had 30 feet of 5/8 chain, which is pretty thick, pretty burly stuff. And then after that, I had about 200 feet of pretty thick rode, which is just a very durable type of rope meant to hold, your boat, basically. I learned a really important lesson. You should have all chain, always, for a number of reasons. In this case, the wind went against the current in the anchorage in Key West, which causes my boat to spin a little bit. It caught the rode and actually flossed it between the keel and the hull, eventually cutting it. So I woke up, pretty normal morning, but then I just start hearing, on the hull of my boat. And I know most all the boat noises my boat makes, so I immediately jump outside, and what do you know? I am really close to an island, and all these other boats seem to have moved right next to me during the middle of the night. All right, so I realized quickly I was dragging anchor as a best case scenario. I yelled to David, start the engine immediately. I did not want to go up onto this island. Did not want to get stuck on there. That was probably my biggest fear. That and doing any damage to another boat. Thankfully, this all happened on a really calm night. And I mean thankfully. Every step of this could have gone so much worse. So David runs up. I yell, no, pull in the road. Just pull in whatever you can, because I had a feeling. And I'll never forget his face looking back at me. He's like, Daniel? And he's got this, chewed up piece of road with nothing else on it. And I'm like, that's fine. We're leaving. We're not going to stay here anymore. So I motor us around, had to actually pay for us to be on a mooring ball, because I had spare and backup anchors, but I wasn't about to pull those out just yet. I think I had them as a emergency now, ready to go, but nothing more than that. So the next day I go diving for my anchor. I think 2 days prior to that, I had gotten bumped by a bull shark while I was trying to dive this wreck. And this water was pretty murky. It wasn't a friendly dive, but after about, 45 minutes, maybe a little less than an hour, and I knew I would find it. I never had a doubt in my mind that if I combed the anchorage, put up a grid, and just kept free diving it, it's about 30 feet deep. So it wasn't the shallowest anchorage. It wasn't the deepest either, though, but eventually I found the road, which, because of the current, was getting swept, really far to one side, like a big telltale. So I grabbed that and I swim it up, and it was a really good feeling. It was kind of my best find I've ever found freediving. So we reattached the anchor with a bowline just for the time being because that was better than nothing, and it still had 30 feet of really burly chain to help set the anchor. I posted about this on Facebook, and that's where I found out that anchors are apparently like a religion amongst the sailing community. Got a lot of strong opinions about everything, but one thing I did take away from it was your boat should be held to wherever it is with all chain. Chain can't get cut. Not only that, the more chain you have, the more likely your anchor is to hold in place. It's more weight on the bottom. It will hold the shank of the anchor closer down to the bottom as you're trying to set the anchor in and as winds or current pull you against you. It also acts like a spring during a storm because as the wind is blowing you and the waves try to make your bow rise up and down, it has to pull up all that weight of the chain at a distance. So, okay, gotta get chain. Turns out I had 5/16 chain on the boat, but I was thinking, that won't fit into my manual windlass. Turns out my manual windlass will accept both sizes of chain. So I put a hard shackle on it, and that's what I've used ever since, and it's worked great. So anyway, David and I next sail a little bit more up the chain of the Keys. At this time, I was thinking about either sailing to Cuba or the Bahamas. Didn't really know much about either. I think at the time I considered the Bahamas to be like a tourist attraction. I didn't realize how spread out it was and how oftentimes rugged and remote it can be. So we continue sailing up. We buddy boated again with some of our friends and eventually get to Marathon. David ended up getting off there after a couple weeks because I wasn't going to be going anywhere and just refitting. So he left for bigger and better, adventures of his own. And while I was there, I kind of fell in love with Marathon and the cruiser community. They did a VHF radio kind of like chat every single morning. It was a great way to stay connected with everybody else that was there. I became a bit of a part of the community around there. Definitely being the youngest active sailor with my own boat, and still kind of am pretty much anywhere I go usually. So I had a bit of that going for me, actually. I feel like instead of people holding it against me, much the opposite. Many sailors saw me and wanted to take me under their wing. I remember at one point I actually had to tell people, I was like, hey, I already got somebody helping me on that. I'm good, thank you, though. I had to actually turn people away from helping me, which I've never had that before. It was a fantastic feeling. So anyway, I do a few boat projects there. I put solar panels onto my boat, and I just kind of get ready. I do my research. I end up meeting another really good sailor, Addison Chan, who helps out the entire sailing and cruising community quite often. He literally wrote the book on cruising in Cuba, sailing and cruising in Cuba. So I asked him a lot of stuff, but basically his answer to me, and I think he understood where I was at, was why not go to the Bahamas? Like, you really think like you're going to miss out? So I had to leave my spear gun behind, which was a little tough. I had to get a pole spear because you cannot use a spear gun there. But so I decided that's where I was going to go. I posted again saying, hey, I'm looking for crew members. Now I'm going to the Bahamas. And all right, many people don't want to come join you when you're sailing in the wintertime along the East Coast, just delivering your boat basically. But when you're going over to the Bahamas, people tend to message you. So I got a lot of interest, but as it ended up being, my crew members were already there in the area on a different boat. Paulina and Alejandro. Paulina from Poland and Alejandro from Spain. They had helped somebody else sail their boat around, but now that boat was stationary and staying in Marathon. So I was able to interview them in person, which was great. And they were just a fun-loving couple. I could see that it was just, no matter what, it was going to be a fun time. So I had them join me. We sailed over to Bimini to check in and then just start going around. I went from Bimini to the Isaac Rocks to the Berry Islands, then over to Andros. And then I had to bring them back to Nassau because they could only be on the boat for a month. They flew back home, and I thought about posting for crew, but I decided, I think I'm just going to solo sail for a while. I went back to Andros, speared all up and down through there, a lot of really remote places. I think I went about a month without seeing another sailing or cruising boat, which to me kind of says that more sailors in the Bahamas need to check out Andros. It's a just incredible location. And the locals there are so kind. I can't stress that enough, how kind the locals were there. And it's there that I really developed my groove again of spearfishing and then cooking it up on the sailboat, which combining the two actually proved to be a little bit harder than I originally anticipated. But Anyway, so I sailed from there over to Green Key and then over to the Exumas. I sailed down the Exumas and into Georgetown, which Georgetown is the most heavily cruised location in the Bahamas. Probably the most heavily cruised place in the world, actually. It sees people from all over. It's just a good location, I guess. Got a lot of little things going for it. Tons of good anchoring for pretty much any wind direction. As well, you're in the Bahamas, so it's a great location. Met some really good friends there, other cruisers, who helped me out and such, other cruisers who do YouTube as well, which was really nice just to see some people that I could really relate to. But about that time, I started thinking, okay, what do I want the rest of my cruising season to be like? Because I knew I would have to get out of the Bahamas because of hurricane season, or at least that's kind of how I viewed it then. So I posted looking for another crew member, and now I was getting even more response every time I had done this. But ended up going with a girl from the Netherlands, Yvette. She was my 8th crew member, and I picked her up at Staniel Key, which probably the best place you could pick somebody up. She had come from the Netherlands where it's rainy and wet and cloudy and overcast. Day one, Staniel Key, I take her over to Thunderball Grotto. The sun is shining. I take her over to where the nurse sharks are. We're snorkeling, seeing tons of stuff. The next morning, before anybody else, I think we're the first people on the beach, I take her over to the famous swimming pigs. We had all this food, did all these photos there. So she just got, the best couple of first days you possibly could. We didn't have a lot of wind at first, but I knew I wanted us to sail further north up the Exuma chain. So we kind of worked our way up, did the Rocky Dundas, which is also a bigger grotto, not as well known, but much larger than Thunderball. And we continued up out of there, hit some pretty heavy winds, so we hunkered down for a day or two, and then continued onward to Spanish Wells, sailing out of there, passage over to the Abacos. And I ended up staying around this area, kind of going back and forth for a while, because it had really good protection from any direction. There was a lot to do. There was people to see. A guy got a hold of me through my Adventureman Dan page and said, hey, if you want to come over, I've got a house here. So he was a ton of help. Ended up getting to do a little bit of diving with him as well and fed a lot more people. One of the things I'll just never get tired of doing. I had a friend of mine, Nina, who is a model in New York City. She came down and showed her what the sailing life was all about. And that was really great. Then I met up with my friend and sailing mentor, Addison. Again, he had now just sailed over. So we got to cruise a little bit together, go have dinner, things like that. But I realized that I was kind of done sailing for a little while. I wanted a break. I had been sailing for nonstop for about 9 months now. And I could tell it was starting to wear on me. I could tell I wasn't as sharp as I had been before, and that I was making simple mistakes on the boat that I wouldn't otherwise. So I told Yvette, I'm going to start heading back to the States. You're welcome to join me. But due to visas and stuff, for her to sail in with me would have cost her like $300 or $400, something like that, and paperwork. So instead, she just grabbed a flight, went over to Cuba, had her own adventure there. It was great. I was able to teach her how to sail completely, how to spearfish, taught her a bit about photography and making sushi. And she really got the full experience, I think. And we had a lot of photos to showcase all the fun we ended up having. So that was a lot of fun. So I'm solo sailing again, and it was kind of nice to be solo again. It was kind of nice to just wake up, have the boat to myself, have that that sense of peace on the boat again. So I ended up sailing out of the Bahamas, and I made a few more mistakes. I was washing my seat cushions, and they all blew away. And then just little things like that I was like, okay, I need to stop doing this. I think while I was spearfishing, I almost lost my hand to a shark, which I'm normally a lot quicker than that. The sharks in the Bahamas, the reef sharks, are by far the most aggressive I've ever come across around the world. And I, at this point, come across pretty much every shark that I can think of. But these ones are really tenacious. So, yeah, to me, that just told me, okay, tone down the spearfishing, tone down anything, just get back to the U.S., get some rest, which is what I did. So I sailed across. The night I sailed across, ended up sailing right through a really bad squall. I'll never forget the lightning being so bright, it actually blinded me for about 5 minutes. I couldn't see a thing, even with my lights on. And that was fun. At that point, I wasn't even scared. I was just kind of annoyed. I was like, all right, fine, we'll do this, But anyway, so I sail into Stuart, Florida, along the Treasure Coast, the central coast of Florida. Why I chose there was kind of an interesting one. I, at this point, knew I wanted to take a break, but also I wanted to take this break to work on the boat, do things to it that I've been meaning to. Make upgrades and improvements, as well as make this a better and more comfortable home for me, because that's what this is. This is my home, and it will be for the next couple years, but I needed a place to go and do this, some place that I could easily then come back to the Caribbean, whether it be the Bahamas, Cuba, or somewhere further into the Caribbean, and started looking around, talking to some people, and the area around Stewart came into conversation because just south of Stewart, you get, Jupiter and West Palm Beach, and then eventually you keep going down, you'll get Miami. Super expensive areas, a lot of money through there. For me, it just wasn't financially feasible. I could go to some other places way further up north in the Chesapeake, but didn't really want to go that far. The Stewart area, however, or really just a little further north of Stewart, is where the price starts to come down. You're far enough away from these big money things, but there's still inlets nearby. So I sailed over and I sailed into Stewart, and then talked to a few people. Some other friends of mine were able to come pick me up, drive me to some marinas. So I kind of looked at what the different marinas had to offer. I pretty quickly realized I would bake if I didn't have an air conditioner on for the summertime. I didn't want to just anchor out and then run a generator and then have to figure out how to go back and forth. So as much as it is against my nature, I finally paid rent somewhere. Yep, paid rent. Not something I'm necessarily used to doing, but it's well worth the investment. And it's given me time to focus on the boat as well as my online projects ever since. But I mean, even right now, in order to record this episode, I have to turn my air conditioner off for the noise sake on the microphone. So I'll bake in between recording sessions. Kind of a funny little thing I have to do just to get these episodes out. But anyway, so I settled on a marina, got my boat insured, which was another first for me because I've been really just doing this by the seat of my pants. And if the boat sinks, that's it for me. I'm really all into this lifestyle. I mean, I'll for sure bounce back if something does happen, but it's definitely a concern of mine. And this concern almost became a reality probably a month after I docked when Hurricane Dorian came through. It practically annihilated the places in the Abacos I had just been, which was really, really heartbreaking to see go on, as well as try to figure out what I could do about it. But then as well, Hurricane Dorian's eye was supposed to come within a mile of my boat at one point. Thankfully, after Hurricane Dorian went through the Bahamas, instead of coming into the mainland of Florida, it mostly stayed offshore. I prepped my boat all the same, took my air conditioner off and everything else. The marina turned off the water and electricity everywhere. So I was kind of back to being on the anchor, it felt like, but no solar because I had everything down. And so I'd run my engine periodically to charge my batteries and whatnot. And, it was mostly just one day of kind of holding on and hoping that the storm would keep turning. And I don't think the winds got above 70 knots here. I certainly didn't feel 70 knots of wind. If you followed my Instagram page at the time, I think I was doing Instagram stories or videos or whatever from in the pool. That was where I decided to hang out for the hurricane, was in the pool. Where else would I go though, right? No, some friends actually were very nice. They offered a place for me to stay, so I did have a backup plan. I had everything that was important, my camera gear, spear gear, and all the other sort of stuff in my van, ready to go if the storm did get above. Forget what I think it was 70 knots. Is if at the boat it was 70 knots, I was gonna leave. That was my plan, but I stayed on. It got rocky, wasn't that bad. I survived it, and learned quite a bit more about hurricanes ever since. So in that time, I was able to start making friends on a regular basis around here, which has been a really nice thing since I've been traveling indefinitely for so long. You don't end up having a friend group that you can hang out with or just go do something fun with. So that's been really enjoyable. I picked up kite boarding, which is another major hobby of mine now. Also a very expensive sport when you get into it. I picked up Dungeons and Dragons just as, it's an adventure. Hey, it's an adventure as well. So anyway, I've been able to do all these things as well as prepping my online content as well, which has been really good. And all the while being at a marina, although it pains me and it chews into my budget, gives me a much more reliable place to go get work from. I can get mail here and everything else. It is not as adventurous, but it has become something I've slowly realized over the years that just going on a nonstop trip for as much as like 14 months at a time, it burns you out. and you're not getting the same, not just enjoyment, but you're not even doing like the same things you might do if instead, say, what I intend on doing, which is probably in a perfect world, I'd be sailing and adventuring maybe for 3 months at a time and then taking a month off. The reality is, in the future, I plan on trying to do something more along the lines of maybe 6 months on an adventure and probably around like 2 months or 3 months off an adventure, and just flipping back and forth on that. It gives me time to catch up, and I stay rejuvenated and excited for when I do get a chance to go out instead of just, kind of going through the motions. So finally, 2020 comes around swing, and I'm all ready for the new 2020 cruising season. I've done things to my boat. I added a swim platform off the back. I have new hobbies I'm excited to check out, and COVID-19 happens. I will say I've probably been least affected by COVID than most people. I even did a little post talking about how my travel plans and vacation plans are basically the same as a survival plan. I want to be going out to remote places where there's nobody else. I want to be spearfishing and sustaining myself on the ocean, collecting rainwater and hopefully getting a water maker soon. And all those things are great for a COVID situation. Unfortunately, though, society's reaction to COVID is really what I've been afraid of. And it hasn't been that bad. It's been an inconvenience, to say the least, a few times, but it hasn't really been that bad. So I end up getting delayed in my season because of COVID. I didn't want to leave my slip and find out that every slip everywhere gets taken up, which when COVID first happened looked like a real possibility. I also didn't want to, leave and then not be allowed to come back into the U.S. I mean, it was pretty unprecedented just a few months ago, several months ago, but it was pretty unprecedented. Didn't really know what was going to happen. And, on the nightly news, they're not talking about how it affects a sailor. So I very much so have to be aware of what's going on for myself, as well as for any crew that I have on board who I'm then responsible for. So anyway, I eventually get to the point where I'm like, okay, I want to do some cruising. I at least need to get the rust out, literally, but metaphorically. So I decided I was going to cruise up and down the intercoastal waterway a little bit. I had never been further north than, I think, Fort Pierce on the ICW. So I posted out and got my 9th crew member, Jordan, from Colorado. She's the youngest crew member that I've ever had, but in particular was really helpful with helping me to understand Instagram. I'm really, really bad on Instagram. It's not a platform I enjoy, but she helped me understand it quite a bit and launch a new page, which I have now since gone back to the original just to keep the name, all together, of Adventureman Dan. But we had a really good, I think it was like 3 weeks or so that she came over for. I taught her how to sail and cruise in that time, taught her the basics of kite boarding, and we weren't really able to do any spearfishing just because of the weather that came in. We had a really strong southerly, I remember. It was like 30 knots. So I said, hey, let's open up the jib and only the jib, and let's sail down the ICW. And I think we were doing like 9 knots sometimes in the intercoastal waterway with just the jib up. It was pretty ridiculous, but it was a ton of fun. So we had a good time together, and then I had been talking with somebody else for the better part of a year off and on who wanted to be a crew member for the Bahamas, but couldn't because of a nursing contract. So we keep talking, and we find out that we actually have a mutual friend that I've been kiteboarding with. She comes up, we talk a lot, and I tell her that I'm thinking about going down to the Keys, just so I'm not leaving the country, but also so I can get some cruising and some good spearfishing in. She ends up becoming my 10th crew member, Alicia from Georgia, and together we sail all the way down throughout all of the Keys. We didn't go down to the Dry Tortugas, I just didn't think it was worth the trip, but we had a really fun time. We did some really good spearfishing off of Marquesas Key, had a really close encounter, nearly rode a greater hammerhead off of Marquesas Key, and then the weather was pretty bad a lot of times, so we ended up hunkering down over by the Mud Keys. Again, if you follow my Adventureman Dan Facebook page, I talk quite a bit about this area. It was really good for anchoring, and then I would actually spearfish in between the channels, between the mangroves where the ocean would, sweep in through. And I wasn't going to break any records over there, but what I did get every single time was the billions, I'm sure, of mangrove snapper, which are delicious. They're very, very clean, very healthy fish. Again, I'm not going to break any records, and I'm not going to be trophy fish, but I'm going to make a meal every single time. And actually, as it turned out, Alicia made the meal every time, being a phenomenal cook, as well as she kiteboarded a bit better than me. she could spearfish pretty well as well. So she was a really good crew member. I had a lot of fun. We had a lot of kite boarding and just ate a lot of fish. It was really good. We ended up sailing back. She had obligations she had to get back to as well. I was kind of over cruising for the season. It was good to get out for the full month that we did, and that's more than many sailors did get to get out for. But the Florida Keys for me just aren't that exciting after a little while. And I would definitely still go back there, but it's a place that, I can never seem to be able to find a really good anchorage where I could stay as long as I'd like, or it's really difficult to go in and get supplies, even though you're in the US, which is kind of a pain. On top of that, I really wanted to reduce the amount of time that we were spending anywhere near land, because we were basically self-isolating. We ended up cruising with a few other boats, and that was fantastic. I really do miss that. Met a great couple on a catamaran, met another really great older couple on a monohull, and we spent a lot of time together, did a lot of dinners and whatnot. So it was a really great time, but eventually we head back up. I come back to my same marina slip, which is a little bit of a bummer, but I'm happy I'm here able to get work done. I gotta just keep telling myself that, continuously going out on the next adventure just hasn't been conducive to producing any of the content that I've been getting, and that's a really big focus of mine now. So anyway, in the past couple months, I figured that would have been it for the cruising season, but a friend of a friend offers for me to join him on his motor yacht to go over to the Bahamas for spearfishing. And of course, I immediately said yes. So we had to go through some COVID tests and do some other stuff, but eventually we get the green light, we get to go ahead. And first day over there was okay spearfishing, nothing great. It was mostly shallower spots than I'm used to. But I'm cleaning the fish off the back of this motor yacht, and I see some nurse sharks coming. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I'll jump in, get some footage. And then I see a pretty big greater hammerhead shark, and I couldn't have gotten in the water faster. Greater hammerheads are not a particularly aggressive species towards people. Not only that, they're just not equipped really to be a man-eater the same way that a bull shark, tiger shark, or a great white can. Not to say they're not dangerous. I'm still absolutely on edge when I'm around them, but I really, really wanted to get close to this thing, and it let me. On multiple swims through, I was able to grab its dorsal fin and go for a ride for a little bit. Just got pretty close more than a few times and got some really good footage, which for me is starting to become another major passion of mine. Not just spearing the fish, that's important to me still, but getting footage of spearing the fish and then processing the fish well, using as much of it as I can. Continuing to be what I really want Adventureman Dan to be about. So anyway, I get all this footage, we have a great time, come back over, and that's really where I'm at today. I'm sitting here back on my boat. I don't have any major adventures planned. Specifically, I'm actually trying to stay away from any major adventure. I'll probably go up to North Carolina to the Outer Banks for a week to do some kite boarding with some buddies. But besides that, my plan for the rest of 2020 is to focus on video editing, getting all of my production out, and then as it starts to get a little bit cooler, there's several major boat projects I want to start working on. But I'm still aware of the fact that I could sail my boat out of here today, and it's definitely a great feeling to know that I can just leave, go on an adventure, get out of Dodge, wherever I gotta go to. Again, I'm not in a great hurry to do that, but for sure, come the beginning of 2021, I'll have a new crew member or two and be going to destinations unknown. Probably I want to do another run of the Bahamas into some places I hadn't and a few places I had. And then maybe come back and do one last sailboat refit before I really head away from Florida, maybe into the rest of the Caribbean, maybe through the Panama Canal. Eventually I will be going through the Panama Canal. And from there, I will most likely go up into the Sea of Cortez and then around the Pacific side of Baja all the way up to San Diego, where I'll be able to dive some of the places I had years prior, Catalina Island, as well as some of the other Channel Islands and even San Clemente. But that's as far north on the west coast of the USA that I'd want to go. Probably coming back down and eventually going to do a Pacific crossing. That's the major, major goal that lays ahead of me. And the place that really I've been wanting to get my boat to before I had a boat is the South Pacific and French Polynesia, Tahiti, all these other islands that are just way out there that are so remote that's what's kept them wild. And that's the whole point for me of having a sailboat, is getting to these places that are completely wild, but still having my home and everything I need to document and enjoy these areas all right here with me. So what started out way back in 2014 as just a really excited guy out there spearfishing, then turned into feeding people, which turned into doing videos, which turned into a way for me to travel on the cheap and make good contacts and good friends. And now today, where I own my own boat, it's not just so much a case of going out to remote locations and spearfishing or kiteboarding or what have you, but it's a chance for me now to bring other people with me, because traveling solo, it gets lonely. It weighs on you. But being able to bring somebody else with you, and I don't just mean literally being able to have crew members, that's always great as well, and I learn a lot from them and they learn a lot from me. But what I really enjoy about my Adventureman Dan brand is that I can sort of bring you, the listener, the follower, the viewer, on these travels with me to all these places, and I get a great sense of community out of that. I love hearing from people. I love hearing what you enjoy hearing or seeing that I'm doing. So if you've gotten this far in the podcast, I think we're about an hour and 45 minutes into it. First off, thank you. I really appreciate you sticking through and listening to everything. You've just gotten a full rundown of where I've been and what I've done, and a bit about my future plans as I continue to sail and adventure around the world. If you enjoyed this first podcast episode and feel like you got something out of it, or you just enjoyed the storytelling, please let me know. I love hearing from people. I love hearing that they're enjoying being a part of my adventures. But likewise, maybe you didn't enjoy everything. Well, I enjoy hearing that as well. It gives me criticism to thereby build upon, which helps me out in my future episodes. And speaking of my future episode, the next one will be episode 2, How I Got Here Financially and Logistically. I'll talk a lot more in depth about the money that goes into this, and more importantly, the money that doesn't go into this. That's kind of my secret. Little sneak peek for you. That's kind of my secret, is how I don't spend money, which allows anybody, no matter how old or hopefully how young you are. I'd love to get more people that are even younger than 20 into this lifestyle, because it doesn't matter what you do with your life after something like this. You're never going to look back and say, man, I really wish I spent more time in the office. Man, I really wish I audited a few more accounts. Like, no, people look back on their life and they remember these incredible moments when they're out there in the wilderness or in the water or alone on a boat or with friends on a boat. So I'd like to be able to give that to more people and help them live their own adventures. So check it out soon. At the Helm with Adventureman Dan, episode 2, How I Got Here Financially and Logistically. I'll see you there. If you enjoyed this podcast episode and were either inspired, entertained, or maybe even you learned something, please consider supporting Adventureman Dan on Patreon. You'll get exclusive early access to my YouTube videos and epic mentories, Facebook posts, and other content sometimes months before the general public, as well as tons of extra not seen anywhere else. And it can cost as low as $3, but helps me out tremendously. Also, if you haven't yet, check out my Adventureman Dan YouTube channel for the full videos of my epic adventures, that I've edited so far. Bear with me as I continue to get caught up, but there's some great content on there already, as well as more to come. Or, if you like to do a bit of reading, take a look at the official Adventureman Dan Facebook page. There's tons of posts dating way back to the inception of Adventureman Dan, and it's easily the most complete and accurate archive of my adventures so far. And if you still want more, why not follow me on Instagram at adventureman_Dan, where I post some amazing, albeit random photos from my travels around the world. And of course, you can always check out my website, www.adventuremandan.life, as a central resource for all my content and the best way to get a hold of me. Or if you're interested in literally joining the crew aboard Adventureborn, I have a whole page on the website dedicated to just that. Go ahead and check it out. Alright, well, you've made it to the very end. Now get out and go start your own adventure.